Albinism is a rare, non-contagious, genetically inherited condition which commonly results in the lack of melanin pigment in the hair, skin and eyes, causing vulnerability to sun exposure. This is very much the nexus between this condition and climate change because people with albinism continue to suffer and die from weather-related events. I am Abdullahi Hassan, welcoming you to the concluding part of a two-series production on climate change and albinism by West Africa Democracy Radio in collaboration with the Africa Albinism Network, AAN. To you listening in the Gambia, Ghana, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, and across the world on WADR.org, many thanks for tuning in. EnviroScope is WADR's environment flagship program that highlights anything and everything from climate change to agriculture, health and environment to sustainable living, agribusiness and aquaculture, and other environment-related topics. This week's package on climate change and albinism brings more on the daily challenges, the erroneous beliefs and myths influenced by superstition, marginalization, and social exclusion that people with albinism face primarily due to their physical appearance. In addition, their right to education, which is fundamental and protected under key international human rights frameworks, is severely hindered. And so, we begin this edition with an excerpt of a report presentation last October by Muluka and Mitzi Drummond, an independent UN expert on the enjoyment of human rights by persons with albinism. She told the United Nations Human Rights Council about the many ways that people with albinism are impacted by social, economic, and climatic factors.
These include exclusion from school curricula, sports and higher education, lack of reasonable accommodation, including assistive devices, or challenges in obtaining these, hurdles in traveling to school due to inaccessible transport systems, fear of attacks, or fear of harsh exposure to the sun without appropriate skin protection, pervasive stigma and discrimination, and rampant bullying, which appears to exist in many regions that I reviewed. In relation to bullying, I was deeply saddened to note that a number of persons with albinism reported insensitive comments from educators that could amount to bullying. I would like to emphasize that the barriers to accessing education are not only evident in Africa or low-income countries, but in all regions throughout the globe, regardless of the GDP of the state. What appears to differ in some cases is the manifestation of this barrier. For example, while those with albinism in low-income countries generally do not receive assistive devices or receive devices which may not be appropriate for their needs, such as braille writers, those in higher-income countries often struggle to navigate the social protection systems which should enable them to obtain these and therefore do not receive them or have delayed access to them. It is essential to note that a delay in receiving assistive devices leads to students falling behind and perhaps even having to drop certain subjects. It is also essential to note that reasonable accommodations must also be provided in relation to vulnerability to the sun and not just low visual acuity. My report also provides examples of good practices instituted by states and civil society organizations. These include raising awareness among educators about the needs of persons with albinism, reasonable accommodations in class and during exams, including extra time for learners with albinism, campaigns to minimize the risk of skin cancer for learners, establishing partnerships between states and CSOs to distribute sunscreen and magnifiers within education settings, and mentorship programs and scholarships for learners with albinism. Notwithstanding these good practices, there is still a long way to go to effectively realizing the right to education for persons with albinism. However, while Law 210 is a significant beacon of hope, challenges remain, including the need to raise awareness of albinism, including in groups other than the Guna. The need to combat discrimination and pervasive bullying, particularly of children and learners with albinism, and also to tackle the impact of climate change.
Muluka and Mitzi Drummond, an independent UN expert on the enjoyment of human rights by persons with albinism, speaking there. Joining us from Accra, Ghana is Kwame Andrew Daklo, Advocacy Manager at the Africa Albinism Network. If you followed last week, Andrew Daklo enlightened us about albinism, a genetic condition, and went on further to explain some of the interventions by his organization, which he said cover 3 thematic areas, the third being on climate change. In conclusion, Kwame Andrew Daklo takes us through AAN's findings and recommendations for protecting people with albinism.
Thank you, Hassan, once again. And so climate change and albinism is core and very dear to the heart of AN. The fact that persons with albinism die due to their daily interaction with the environment or the climate, which keeps changing. And about 90 to 98% of persons with albinism in Africa die because of their engagement in their environment and because there is massive amount of UV ray radiation or UV ultraviolet radiation coming from the sun. And persons with albinism cannot always stay indoor. You need to go out. Even if you are going to office, you need to even walk a distance to get to a car park, to take a car. And for those of us who are maybe fast and want to use a motorbike, you need to sit. So this interaction is something that we cannot prevent, and therefore we need to find a different way to mitigate this. And this is where this particular thematic area is very core to the heart of the African Albinism Network, because we say that number of people who die from skin cancer are more than the number of attacks that are meted against persons with albinism.
So, Kwame, before we proceed, kindly explain in detail what UV radiation is and how it really affects people with albinism.
The sun emits a lot of radio waves, and these radio waves are supposed to be filtered through the ozone layer before probably maybe very limited amounts reaching the Earth's surface. But due to human activity and industrial evolution, which are emitting gases, these gases tend to destroy the ozone layer. There's a lot of penetration in the ozone layer. So instead of these UV rays being emitted by the sun being filtered by the ozone layer, they rather penetrate through these holes that are created by the dangerous gases we create on the Earth. And these UV rays reach the Earth's surface directly. This is what impacts persons with albinism particularly, but every other person. So instead of person with albinism getting natural protection, which is given by melanin, we are rather getting burnt because we don't have that natural shield that protects us from these UV rays emitted by the sun.
And for AAN, you said that this is even on the increase given the rise in temperature level and the impact of global warming.
Exactly, yes. Global warming and everything about the climate is on the increase because human population is increasing, demand for various things are also increasing, so production of things are increasing, and the emission of dangerous gases which destroy the ozone layer keep increasing. That's why, the whole world is trying to mitigate this by saying that let's all target to barriers minimum those dangerous gases into the atmosphere to stop destroying the ozone layer. So, yeah, everything is on the increase, and the impact on the daily life of persons with albinism is very dire.
So talk about impact. Which of the region is most affected, or is it right now a global phenomenon that no matter where a person with albinism lives, be it in sub-Saharan Africa, in Asia, or in any of the Americas, that climate change actually still impacts on their health?
Climate change is global because climate change comes with different events. It can be flooding, it can be heat waves, it can be even melting of the glaciers. It can be emission of excessive UV radiation. So depending on wherever you stay as a person, you will experience one form of climate change or the other. Either you are experiencing flooding. So if it's a flooding, for example, a typical example is in Malawi, there was Cyclone Freddy, and this pushes people from their natural homes and their natural protections and then push them to an open space. They have to pitch a camp. The person with albinism was killed because she is now living in a camp without any proper home. So that is one impact of climate change on a person with albinism. And another impact is in Madagascar. Similarly, another event of climate change, which is heat wave and long droughts. So people have to resort to different means of survival. And they believe that when you use the body part of person with albinism in a portion, you'll be able to get well. And therefore, they started attacking persons with albinism in Madagascar, southern part of Madagascar. So a lot of persons with albinism were attacked and killed because of the impact of climate change on the means of survival of people.
We already know from several research documents, materials, and of course testimonies that women and children are at the receiving end of the impact of climate change. So is the challenge even greater for people with albinism who are women and young girls in rural areas or communities where they really depend on farming for survival?
The impacts for women and girls is much higher in all circumstances. But once that woman or that child has albinism, the impact becomes much greater, even if not double or quadruple, because one, the vulnerability of a woman, probably because of low vision and all the challenges that come with being a woman, then all the challenges that come with being albinism. So that makes it kind of a double already. And then if you come to the children, you have to face the challenges of being a child, very vulnerable, and then you add the challenges of being a child with albinism. So the impact just doubled because that person has albinism. And especially if you live in rural area, it means you are far from resources, health facilities. You are far from information, you see. So to make it even the more dangerous, of those individuals become more vulnerable because of where they live.
And again, Kwame, those in the urban centers are more likely to be educated and perhaps may not be at the upper class but belong to the middle class, so they can afford some of these protective gears, right?
Perfectly, yeah. That is exactly what we mean. Because they happen to be living in the urban area, they're able to have some level of education, and then they're able to understand what condition they are living in. They're able to exercise their right protection, right? So these are the things. The impact is much greater, especially if you are a woman and you have albinism. And the worst of it is when you live in a rural area, because you don't have any resources. You might not have the adequate education to understand your condition. And you might not even have the adequate resources to protect yourself from the danger that you are exposed to. And worst of it is even the UN even says that persons with albinism are more exposed to the dangers of the UV radiation because most of them work outdoors, right? This is how it works. In a classroom, the person struggles to even understand lessons because of the low vision. Not easy to follow lessons, especially when teachers do not understand their condition and write legibly or provide the necessary reasonable accommodation in the classroom. So that person is unable to progress adequately in education to the highest level. In most cases, they drop off along the way. So that leads you into the street doing the menial jobs, right? Which you have to do in the sun, probably selling in the traffic, or going into farming, or having to work in a construction site. So this condition exposes you more into the sun. And if you don't have the actual protection, especially the sunscreen that you can apply on a regular basis, then it means you are rather burning yourself. And with time, that burning can lead into skin cancer, which eventually kills you.
Let's settle more now about the roles of AN regarding climate change and people with albinism, right? So what sort of interventions have you rendered so far?
Since we shifted focus to thematic area-based interventions, on climate change, we have done a number of interventions. For example, training and capacity development, where we engage albinism group leaders and other advocates to understand what are the impact of climate change on persons with albinism, and for them to start speaking and educating each other and others to know that the weather has very dire impact on ourselves. And we also call something advocacy in action. We do a lot of advocacy in various fora. For example, in 2023, I was in a number of conferences speaking on the impact of climate change on persons with albinism. one organized by the Center for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria for their annual disability conference in Africa, where I educated the audiences and the attendants on the impact of climate change on albinism. We also have individual interactions with organizations and albinism groups in various countries to educate them on albinism and how this impacts their livelihood. At the highest level, we engage with the AU at the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, where we present statements at each of their ordinary sessions. We give them recommendations as to what they should do, the member states should do. And our biggest call is ensuring that countries, Africa-wide and even worldwide, provide sunscreen lotions for persons with albinism at no cost or even at a reduced cost, and make it readily available for persons with albinism in health facilities closest to them, so that they don't have to walk distances, exposing themselves again in the sun before going for sunscreen.
So, Kwame, let me ask in particular about the issue of sunscreen. What are the response being like from stakeholders?
Generally, I would say government response to the provision of sunscreen is very slow. It's very, very slow, because as we speak, only few countries are able to do that, but not as expected. Especially, we notice provision of sunscreen for persons with albinism in Zambia, in Kenya. Kenya is a typical example. Kenya has been very good at the provision of sunscreen for persons with albinism. To some extent, though not reaching the areas. South Africa has also been doing that. Namibia has been doing that. These are the few countries that I can pinpoint and have some policy in the provision of sunscreen for persons with albinism. That I think, since the advocacy is picking up on climate change and its impacts, let me just emphasize on one of our projects at the African Albinism Network, where we are now pushing for the World Health Organization to add sunscreens to the international list of essential medicines. The sunscreens are just not any ordinary creams. We can compare sunscreen, or actually say sunscreen for persons with albinism is an assistive device. For example, if you are providing, say, wheelchairs or white canes for people with physical disabilities and people with visual impairments, what person with albinism you need to provide for them is the sunscreen. That is the closest comparison you can make. We need sunscreens to be able to move around. Just as persons with physical disability need wheelchairs to move around, just as persons with visual impairment need white canes to move around. Without that, it means we are just going to be indoors if you don't want to get burnt. And survival instinct will not allow you to stay indoor. You are just going to die of hunger. So that's why we are pushing that at the international level, the World Health Organization should take action to re-add these sunscreens to the essential medicines for persons with albinism, to actually have these creams as a life-saving tool for them to increase their survival rates. And this call is not only to WHO, but also to all states, especially those in African countries, to ensure that sunscreens are provided free for persons with albinism, and in situations where it cannot be free, then it should be at a reduced cost, and most importantly, affordable and available for persons with albinism to access.
Kwame Andrew Daklo, Advocacy Manager at the Africa Albinism Network, AAN. In rounding up is the voice of Layla, a young girl living with albinism who is urging for accessibility of sun blockers and why it must be reinstated on the World Health Organization's list of essential medicines. To achieve this, the Africa Albinism Network is asking to sign a petition to save the lives of many people with albinism by protecting them from skin cancer.
Hello, my name is Layla. For me and for many people with albinism across Africa, our right to education is a matter of life and death. Because albinism often causes vision impairment, we need reasonable accommodation and support to access education. Without education, people with albinism end up working outdoors, where the harmful rays of the sun cause skin cancer. Low education rates and climate change are some of the reasons why skin cancer is the number one killer of people with albinism. As climate change worsens and harmful UV rays increase across Africa, we ask for support from our government to ensure reasonable accommodation in schools. As for you, you can also do something. Help save people with albinism from dying from skin cancer. You can do so by signing the petition to ask the World Health Organization to include sun blockers on their list of essential medicines.
Leila is a young girl living with albinism. That's how we end this week's edition of EnviroScope, WADR's environment program. Follow our discussions on X, formerly Twitter, Instagram at WADR News, on Facebook, WADR English Service, and online at wadr.org. Also, kindly drop a message on our WhatsApp platform using +221 7818 45421. Again, +221 7818 45421. Many thanks to our listeners in the Gambia via Numi FM, Banjul, in Nigeria on Alberca Radio, Bauchi State, Northeast, in Ghana via Radio Pod 95.1, Damango Savannah region, and Gbaft FM, Sierra Leone. I am Abdullahi Hassan. Until next week, do take care of yourselves and the environment. Stay safe.